A police cruiser rolled to a stop outside a small logistics office, just after closing time, its headlights cutting through the evening haze as a woman locked the front door behind her. She was tired, the kind of tired that came from 12 hours of phone calls, invoices, and making sure 22 employees got paid on time. She did not see the second cruiser pull in behind the first. Two officers stepped out, unhurried, almost casual, the way men walk when they already believe they hold every advantage. They told her they had received a tip that she was moving dirty money through her company, and before she could ask for a warrant, they were already inside. They tore through her office, cracked open the safe, pocketed the company laptop, the petty cash, even her own wristwatch and phone. When she asked them to write a report, one of them laughed and said nobody would believe a word she said anyway. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for a weapon she did not have. She only asked one quiet question: "Are you certain you want to do this?" And they laughed harder. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that exactly 30 minutes later, the entire police department would be thrown into lockdown when a call came in from the Pentagon itself. The woman they had just robbed in broad daylight was not only a business owner, she was a former Delta Force commander, the kind of soldier whose name made battlefields go silent. The city she lived in sat in the heart of the American South, a mid-sized place where everyone seemed to know everyone, where church bells on Sunday mornings still meant something, and where a black-owned logistics company on the edge of downtown had quietly become one of the most reliable operations in the region. Maya Coleman built that company from nothing, starting with one used delivery van and a handwritten ledger, growing it over 6 years into a fleet of 12 trucks and a warehouse that moved freight for half a dozen regional retailers. Her employees respected her, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it every single day. She paid fairly. She showed up early. She remembered the names of every driver's children. When a forklift operator named Pete had a heart scare the year before, Maya covered his medical bills out of her own pocket before insurance even processed the claim, and she never mentioned it again. People who worked for Maya did not just like her. They trusted her with the kind of trust that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. She drove an old gray sport utility vehicle with over 190,000 miles on it, the kind of car that made delivery clients assume she was just another logistics manager rather than the owner of the entire operation. She did not wear expensive jewelry. She did not flash a designer bag or talk about vacations she had taken. Her one indulgence, if you could call it that, was a black coffee from the gas station, 2 blocks from her warehouse, the same order every single morning at 6:15. At the end of each day, after the trucks had rolled back in and the loading bay doors had been pulled shut, Maya sat alone in her small office and went through the day's numbers herself, line by line, refusing to delegate even that small task to anyone else. She believed that the person who signs the checks should be the person who understands exactly where every dollar goes. There was something different about the way Maya carried herself, something her employees noticed but rarely discussed out loud. She was calm in a way that felt almost unnatural, the kind of calm that comes from having survived situations far worse than a late shipment or an angry client. She never raised her voice, not even when a truck broke down on the highway during a holiday rush, not even when a client threatened to cancel a 6-figure contract over a missed deadline. She simply assessed the situation, gave 2 or 3 clear instructions, and moved forward without wasted motion. Her eyes had a habit of sweeping a room the moment she entered it, cataloging exits, counting people, noting who stood where, a habit so ingrained that she did it without thinking, the way some people instinctively check their phone or glance at a clock. In the corner of her office, mounted on the wall just behind her desk, sat an old wooden box, scuffed at the edges, its hinges slightly rusted from age. A small insignia was carved into its lid, faded enough that most people who saw it assumed it was decorative, some kind of family heirloom, or a piece of folk art Maya had picked up at an estate sale. None of her employees had ever asked her about it directly, and Maya had never offered an explanation. It simply sat there, day after day, a quiet object that held more weight than anyone in that building could possibly understand. It was the kind of detail a person might walk past 100 times without a second thought, until the day it suddenly mattered more than anything else in the room. That particular evening had been unremarkable, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that blends into every other Tuesday. The trucks had returned on schedule. The warehouse was quiet, except for the hum of the overhead lights. Maya had finished reviewing the day's manifests, signed off on 3 new shipping contracts, and was locking the front door when she noticed the first set of headlights swing into the parking lot, followed closely by a second. She did not think much of it at first. Police presence in that part of town was not unusual. Sometimes officers stopped by simply to use the restroom or grab a bottle of water from the vending machine in the lobby. But something about the way these 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles told her this was not a routine visit. Their posture was wrong. Their hands rested too deliberately near their belts. And the look on their faces carried the particular kind of confidence that came from men who believed, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened next would never have any real consequences for them. The 2 officers crossed the parking lot with the unhurried stride of men who had done this before and never once been questioned for it. The taller one, a thick-necked man with a buzz cut and a name tag reading Dawson, stepped directly in front of Maya before she could finish locking the door. The second, leaner and younger, hung back slightly, his hand resting near his radio as if expecting trouble that did not exist. Dawson informed her, without preamble, that they had received a credible tip that her business was being used to launder money, and that they needed to search the premises immediately. Maya asked, calmly and clearly, whether they had a warrant. Dawson smiled, the kind of smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever, and told her that warrants were a formality for people who had nothing to hide, and that cooperating now would go a lot better for her than making this difficult. She knew in that instant exactly what kind of men she was dealing with. She had encountered their type before, men who mistook a badge for permission, who confused authority with righteousness. But she also understood something else, something far more important in that moment. Her employees were still inside, finishing the last of the evening paperwork. A confrontation, a physical one, would put them at risk, and risking civilian lives over property was never, under any circumstances, the correct calculation. So Maya stepped aside, unlocked the door fully, and allowed them in, her jaw tight, her eyes tracking every single movement they made. What followed was not an investigation. It was theft conducted under the cover of a badge. The 2 officers moved through Maya's office like men raiding a vending machine, with no system, no procedure, no respect for evidence chain of custody, or any of the protocols real law enforcement would have followed. Dawson went straight for the safe in the back corner, the one bolted into the concrete floor that held the company's petty cash reserve, along with several employee paychecks waiting to be distributed the following morning. He pried it open with a crowbar he had brought from his cruiser, an object no legitimate search would ever require, and began stuffing bundles of cash into a duffel bag he had carried in with him. The younger officer swept Maya's desk clean, taking her company laptop, 2 external hard drives containing years of shipping records, and the cell phone she used to coordinate deliveries across 3 states. One of Maya's drivers, a young man named Marcus, who had stayed late to finish loading the morning's first route, stepped out of the break room and froze in the doorway, watching the scene unfold in disbelief. He instinctively reached for his own phone to start recording, but Dawson turned, fixed him with a hard stare, and told him plainly that any recording would be considered interference with an active investigation, a charge that carried real jail time. Marcus lowered his phone, his hands shaking, his eyes flicking to Maya, as if hoping she would tell him what to do. Maya gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not yet," that gesture said. "Not here. Not now." The younger officer, emboldened by his partner's confidence, reached up and yanked the small security camera mounted above the office door, ripping its wiring loose and tossing it carelessly onto the desk. It was a small, almost casual act of destruction, but it told Maya everything she needed to know about how calculated this entire operation truly was. These men had done this before. They had a system. They knew exactly which evidence to eliminate, and exactly how to frame their actions in a way that would protect them later. As Dawson zipped the duffel bag closed, now heavy with cash, electronics, and even Maya's wristwatch, which he had taken almost as an afterthought, he turned back toward her with that same cold smile. He told her, almost conversationally, that if she tried to file a complaint, if she tried to make any noise about this at all, they would simply report that she had resisted arrest, that she had become combative during a lawful search, and that her word against two sworn officers would not last 5 minutes in front of any judge in this county. He seemed to relish saying it, watching her face for some flicker of fear or desperation. Maya gave him neither. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable, and asked him one simple question in a voice so calm it almost unsettled him. "Are you certain," she asked, "that you want to do this?" Dawson laughed, a short, dismissive bark of a sound, and told his partner to load up the car. They walked out of her office, carrying everything of value the business owned, climbed into their cruiser, and drove off into the evening without a single backward glance, leaving Maya standing alone in a ransacked office, the wooden box on the wall behind her, the only thing in the room they had not touched. For a long moment after the cruiser's taillights disappeared around the corner, nobody in the warehouse said a word. Marcus stood frozen near the break room door. Two other employees who had witnessed the tail end of the incident stood near the loading bay, their faces a mixture of fury and helplessness. Someone finally broke the silence, suggesting they call a local news station, that this needed to go online immediately so people would know what had happened, so the department could be held accountable in the court of public opinion, if nowhere else. Voices started rising, anger building, the kind of righteous outrage that comes from watching an injustice unfold in real time with no apparent recourse. Maya raised one hand, just slightly, and the room went quiet again. "Not yet," she said, her voice steady, despite everything that had just happened. She walked back into her office, stepped over the scattered papers and broken camera wiring, and knelt beside a small black case tucked beneath her desk, a case none of her employees had ever seen her open before. She entered a 6-digit code into a panel on its side, and the locks released with a soft mechanical click. Inside, resting in custom-cut foam, were 3 objects that seemed entirely out of place in a logistics office: an encrypted satellite phone, sleek and military-grade, a single challenge coin, its surface engraved with symbols none of her employees recognized, and a faded identification badge, its lamination worn at the edges, bearing a photograph of a much younger Maya in a uniform none of them had ever seen her wear. She lifted the satellite phone and pressed a single button, a speed dial she had not used in years but had never deleted. It rang only once before someone answered, and Maya's voice, when she spoke, carried a tone none of her employees had ever heard from her before: flat, precise, devoid of the warmth that usually colored even her most serious conversations. "They crossed the line," she said, nothing more. A male voice on the other end responded almost instantly, 2 words that seemed to confirm something far larger than anyone in that warehouse could understand. "Confirmed, Commander." The call ended. Maya closed the satellite phone, set it down on her desk, and turned to face her stunned employees, offering no further explanation, no context, nothing to satisfy the dozen questions now written plainly across their faces. She simply told them to go home, to get some rest, and to trust that this would be handled. 20 minutes after that single phone call, the police department 3 miles across town began experiencing something its desk sergeant would later describe as pure chaos. Phones started ringing simultaneously across multiple lines, an unusual pattern that immediately caught the attention of the night shift supervisor. The first call came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's field office, requesting immediate confirmation of an incident involving a business at a specific address, the very address Maya's company occupied. Before the supervisor could even process that request, a second call arrived, this one from the department's own Internal Affairs Division, demanding to know which officers had been dispatched to that location and under what authority. Then came a third call, and this one made the desk sergeant's blood run cold. A direct line from someone identifying themselves as a colonel attached to United States Special Operations Command, asking a single pointed question with an intensity that left no room for casual deflection. "Who?" the colonel demanded. "Just put their hands on Commander Brooks." Nobody at the department had any idea who Commander Brooks was. The name meant absolutely nothing to the desk sergeant, nothing to the shift supervisor, Nothing to the chief, who was hastily summoned back to the building from his dinner at home. Dawson and his partner, still riding the high of their successful heist, had returned to the station and were in the process of quietly stashing the stolen cash and electronics in an unmarked evidence locker they had used before, one that conveniently never seemed to get properly audited. They had no idea their world was already beginning to collapse around them. To them, this had been just another routine shakedown, the kind they had performed a dozen times before against business owners, too afraid or too powerless to fight back. They genuinely believed, with the arrogant certainty of men who had never once faced consequences, that this incident would disappear, exactly like all the others had. While the department scrambled to understand the meaning behind the colonel's call, something else was already moving through the city, something far more deliberate and far more dangerous than any of them realized. A convoy of black sport utility vehicles, 6 in total, entered the city limits from the interstate, traveling in tight formation with their headlights dimmed and their sirens silent. There was no fanfare to their arrival, no flashing lights, no announcement of any kind. They simply moved through the streets with the quiet, controlled precision of men who had done this exact kind of operation more times than they could count, men for whom speed and discretion were second nature. Anyone watching closely might have noticed the vehicle's government plates, or the way each one maintained an exact, almost mathematical distance from the one in front of it, a formation discipline that civilian drivers simply did not possess. Inside the police department, the chief of police arrived to find his night shift supervisor pale and visibly shaken, juggling 3 phone calls at once, while trying to explain to increasingly impatient federal officials that nobody currently on duty seemed to know anything about an incident at a logistics company on the east side of town. The chief demanded answers, and when none came quickly enough, he ordered someone to pull up the dispatch logs for the evening, hoping to identify which officers had been sent to that address and why. What the logs revealed only deepened the confusion. The dispatch had not come through any official channel. Dawson and his partner had taken that call themselves, off the books, exactly as they had done with at least a dozen other tips over the past 2 years. Every single one of them somehow ending with cash and electronics disappearing from local businesses, with no formal charges ever filed. The chief stood in the center of the bullpen, surrounded by ringing phones and confused officers, and for the first time in his 15 years running that department, he felt something he had never experienced before in this job: genuine fear. Whoever Commander Brooks was, the weight behind that name carried enough force to make the Pentagon itself pick up a phone and demand answers within 30 minutes of an incident occurring. That kind of response did not happen for ordinary citizens. It did not happen for wealthy donors or even for elected officials. It happened for people whose service to their country had earned them a level of protection and respect that few civilians could ever fully comprehend, and the chief was now beginning to understand, with mounting horror, that his own officers had just robbed exactly that kind of person in broad daylight, on camera, that had conveniently been destroyed, with no warrant and no justification whatsoever. 15 years earlier, in a place far removed from quiet southern streets and small business logistics, Maya Brooks had been known by an entirely different identity. She had earned her place in one of the most elite and secretive units in the United States military, a position reserved for only a handful of operators each year, chosen not just for physical capability, but for an almost unnatural ability to remain calm under conditions that broke most people within minutes. Her unit had been deployed to a region where a group of aid workers and 2 embassy staff members had been taken hostage by an armed faction operating out of a fortified compound, a situation that conventional forces had deemed too dangerous to approach directly. Maya had been given command of the extraction team, a responsibility that came with the full weight of 9 other operators' lives, resting on every decision she made. Intelligence reports indicated the hostage takers significantly outnumbered her team, perhaps by a factor of 4 or 5 to 1, entrenched in a position with multiple defensive points and limited lines of approach. Many in her chain of command had quietly suggested the operation might need to be scrubbed, that the risk to her team was simply too great given the numbers involved. Maya had reviewed the terrain maps for nearly 6 straight hours, barely sleeping, running through every possible entry point, every possible failure scenario, until she found what everyone else had missed: a narrow drainage channel running beneath the compound's eastern wall that intelligence had marked as impassable, but that her own calculations suggested might actually be navigable during the pre-dawn hours when water levels dropped. The operation that followed became, in certain classified circles, something close to legendary. Maya led her team through that drainage channel in complete darkness, emerging inside the compound's perimeter with the element of surprise fully intact. What followed was 11 minutes of controlled, precise action, every movement calculated, every decision made, with the singular goal of bringing every hostage and every member of her own team home alive. When the operation concluded, all 5 hostages had been recovered without a single casualty among them, and remarkably, every member of Maya's team walked away with nothing worse than minor injuries, an outcome that defense analysts later called statistically improbable, given the conditions they had faced. Maya herself had taken a round to the shoulder during the final extraction, a wound she did not even acknowledge until the mission was fully complete and her entire team was safely aboard the extraction helicopter. For that operation, and for the broader body of work she had completed over her years of service, Maya was awarded one of the military's most significant honors, a decoration that, due to the classified nature of her unit's operations, would never be publicly announced or discussed outside a very small circle of people who needed to know. She continued serving for several more years after that mission, taking on increasingly difficult assignments, training younger operators, and eventually deciding, after a particularly difficult deployment that claimed the life of a close friend and fellow commander, that it was time to build something different with the remainder of her life. She left the military with full honors, accepted a quiet ceremony attended only by her closest former teammates, and used her savings along with a small business loan to purchase her very first delivery van. She never told her employees about any of this. She never mentioned the medal, never spoke of the operation, never explained why she sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding from dreams she refused to discuss with anyone. The wooden box in her office held the only physical reminders of that chapter of her life: the medal itself, a folded flag, and a handwritten letter from the families of the hostages she had saved. The words of gratitude she had read perhaps a dozen times over the years, but never shared with another living soul. She had built her business quietly, deliberately, choosing to be known in her community as a fair employer and a reliable partner, rather than as a decorated war hero, because to Maya, that chapter of her life was complete, finished, something she carried privately, rather than something she displayed. Back in the present, the convoy of black vehicles pulled into the parking lot of Maya's warehouse, just as she was preparing to lock up for the second time that evening, having sent her employees home, but stayed behind herself to wait. The vehicle's doors opened in near-perfect unison, and the men who stepped out, dressed in plain civilian clothing that did nothing to disguise their military bearing, moved toward Maya with a discipline that immediately set them apart from anyone in that part of town. The first man to reach her, a broad-shouldered figure with graying temples, snapped to attention and offered a crisp salute, a gesture Maya returned with practiced ease despite having been out of uniform for years. The remaining members of the team followed suit, each one offering the same formal greeting, addressing her not by her civilian name, but by the rank and title that still carried enormous weight within their world. Commander Brooks, they called her, their voices carrying genuine respect rather than mere protocol. Marcus, who had stayed behind to help Maya finish locking up the warehouse, stood frozen near the loading bay, watching this scene unfold with an expression of complete and total shock. The calm, soft-spoken business owner he had worked for over the past 2 years, the woman who remembered his daughter's birthday and covered Pete's medical bills without a second thought, was apparently someone these heavily trained operators treated with the kind of deference usually reserved for generals. Maya gave her team a brief, efficient rundown of exactly what had happened that evening: the fabricated accusation, the missing warrant, the stolen property, the destroyed camera, the threats made against her if she dared to file a complaint. She spoke without emotion, the same flat, precise tone she had used on the satellite phone call earlier. But Marcus could see something flickering behind her eyes now. Something that looked almost like restrained fury, finally being allowed a small amount of room to breathe. The team listened, without interrupting, and when Maya finished speaking, the senior officer simply nodded once and told her that everything would be handled through proper channels, that justice would be pursued correctly and completely, with documentation that no court in the country could ever dismiss. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the police department found itself under a level of scrutiny it had never before experienced. Federal agents arrived at the station entrance, just as the morning shift was beginning, presenting credentials and a formal request for full cooperation in an investigation that had already been authorized at a level well above the local district attorney's office. The chief, exhausted from a sleepless night, spent trying to understand exactly what his officers had gotten the department into, offered immediate and complete cooperation, recognizing that any attempted obstruction now would only compound an already catastrophic situation. Agents requested access to the department's camera footage from the previous evening, but found, unsurprisingly, that the relevant recordings had been mysteriously corrupted. A pattern internal affairs investigators noted had occurred with troubling frequency over the past 2 years, whenever questions arose about certain officers' conduct. Dawson and his partner were brought in separately for questioning, and within minutes, their carefully constructed story began to fall apart. Dawson insisted the search had been conducted based on a legitimate anonymous tip, though he could not produce any record of that tip ever being logged through proper channels. His partner, visibly more nervous under direct questioning, began contradicting key details of Dawson's account, describing the timeline differently, and stumbling when asked to explain why the security camera in Maya's office had been physically removed, rather than simply left running. As internal affairs investigators dug deeper into the department's records, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that extended far beyond this single incident. Over the previous 2 years, at least 11 separate complaints had been filed by local business owners, the overwhelming majority of them, Black entrepreneurs, alleging nearly identical circumstances, sudden unannounced searches based on vague tips, missing cash and property following those searches, and intimidation tactics used to discourage anyone from formally pursuing complaints. Every single one of those previous complaints had been quietly closed without action, buried in a system that seemed almost deliberately designed to protect certain officers from any real accountability. Maya, for her part, said remarkably little during the initial stages of the investigation. She answered every question federal agents asked, with the same precise, measured tone she used in every aspect of her life, providing exact times, exact details, exact sequences of events, without a hint of exaggeration or embellishment. When investigators asked if she had any additional evidence beyond her own testimony, Maya reached into her bag and produced a small encrypted drive, sliding it across the table without comment. What that drive contained would ultimately become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, footage no one in that police department had ever known existed. The drive contained recordings from a backup security system Maya had quietly installed years earlier, a system entirely separate from the main camera the officers had ripped from her wall, hidden discreetly within a smoke detector mounted in the corner of her office, a precaution born from old habits that never fully faded after leaving military service. That hidden camera had captured the entire encounter in clear, unmistakable detail, from the officer's initial entry without presenting any warrant, through the moment Dawson pried open the safe with a crowbar, to his explicit threat that Maya would be charged with resisting arrest if she dared to file a complaint. Alongside that footage, the drive also contained dashcam recordings Maya's own logistics company maintained on the exterior of the building for insurance purposes, capturing the officer's cruiser plates and timestamps that perfectly corroborated every detail of her account. Investigators sat in stunned silence as they reviewed the footage for the first time, watching 2 sworn officers commit what amounted to armed robbery while wearing the uniform meant to protect the very community they were instead exploiting. There was no ambiguity left in the case, no room for the kind of plausible deniability that had protected these officers through 11 previous complaints. The evidence was complete, irrefutable, and utterly damning. By that afternoon, both Dawson and his partner were placed on administrative leave, pending formal charges, their badges confiscated, their service weapons surrendered, the casual arrogance that had defined their behavior the previous evening replaced now with a dawning, desperate realization of exactly how much trouble they were actually in. The formal arrest took place 2 days later, conducted not by local officers, who many in the community no longer fully trusted, but by a joint task force combining federal agents with state investigators, specifically assigned to ensure complete impartiality. Dawson was taken into custody at his own home, led out in handcuffs in full view of his neighbors, his face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and rage, as reporters who had somehow gotten word of the arrest captured the moment on camera. As officers guided him toward the waiting vehicle, he twisted around, his composure finally cracking entirely, and shouted across the lawn toward where Maya stood quietly observing from a respectful distance, demanding to know exactly who she was, what gave her the right to destroy his career and his life, over what he clearly still believed had been a routine, justified search. Maya did not raise her voice, did not move closer, did not display even a flicker of the satisfaction many in her position might have felt watching this moment unfold. She simply answered him with the same calm, even tone she had used on the night of the robbery itself, telling him plainly that she had once commanded soldiers whose names and faces he would only ever encounter in films, men and women who had trusted her with their lives in places far more dangerous than anything he could imagine, and that everything that had happened to him over the past 2 days was a direct consequence of choices he himself had made. As Dawson was loaded into the back of the vehicle, something happened that left every officer present, along with the small gathering of reporters and neighbors, completely speechless. More than 20 men, none of them in uniform, all dressed in plain civilian clothing, stepped forward from where they had been quietly standing along the edges of the property, men whose bearing and discipline marked them unmistakably as former special operations soldiers. They formed a loose line, and as Maya walked past them toward her vehicle, each man came instantly to attention, their posture snapping into a formal salute that held until she had passed completely out of sight. It was not a gesture for show, not something staged for the cameras, now capturing every second of it. It was genuine, earned respect from men who had once served alongside her, who understood exactly what kind of leader she had been, and who had traveled significant distances simply to stand beside her during this moment, even if their role required nothing more than presence. The police chief, who had arrived to personally oversee the arrest given the magnitude of the situation, stood near the curb watching this display unfold, and in that moment, the full weight of what his department had done finally settled over him completely. These were not random vigilantes Maya had called for support. These were trained, disciplined operators who had served with genuine distinction, men who recognized in Maya something the chief's own officers had been too arrogant and too careless to ever properly investigate before deciding she was an easy target. He understood now, with a clarity that made his stomach turn, exactly how catastrophic this mistake had been, not just for Dawson and his partner, but potentially for the department's entire reputation and operational future. Word of the incident spread through the city with remarkable speed, moving from neighbor to neighbor, from local news segments into statewide coverage within a matter of days. The footage from Maya's hidden camera, once entered into the public court record, became impossible to ignore or downplay, circulating widely enough that the department found itself facing a level of public scrutiny it had never previously experienced. Reporters began camping outside the police station, demanding statements from officials who had little choice but to acknowledge that something had gone seriously and systematically wrong within their ranks. A public hearing was scheduled within 2 weeks of the initial incident, convened by the city council in response to overwhelming public pressure, with Maya called to testify about her experience in front of a packed room that included local officials, journalists, and dozens of community members who had shown up simply to witness accountability finally being pursued. Maya arrived dressed simply, no different from how she dressed for any ordinary day at her warehouse, and took her seat at the witness table with the same composed, measured presence she carried into every situation. When asked to describe what had happened, she did so without embellishment, recounting the events of that evening in precise chronological order, her voice steady, even as several council members visibly winced at the details of Dawson's explicit threat to fabricate charges against her if she dared to complain. What made Maya's testimony particularly powerful was not simply the account of her own experience, but the broader context she provided afterward, explaining that her case was far from an isolated incident, that she had since spoken privately with several other business owners in the community, who had experienced strikingly similar encounters with the same two officers over recent years, encounters that had gone unreported because the victims feared exactly the kind of retaliation Dawson had threatened against her. She explained that many small business owners, particularly those without the resources or connections to fight back effectively, often felt they had no realistic path toward justice when facing accusations from officers whose word was almost automatically trusted over their own. Her testimony opened a floodgate. Within days of the hearing, several other victims who had previously remained silent came forward publicly for the first time, their stories corroborating a pattern internal affairs investigators had already begun to suspect, but had lacked sufficient evidence to formally pursue. A bakery owner described nearly the exact same scenario: an unannounced search based on a vague tip, missing cash from her register following the search, and an explicit threat of fabricated charges if she attempted to file a complaint. A mechanic who ran a small auto repair shop described officers confiscating tools and equipment they claimed were suspected stolen property, equipment that was never returned, despite no charges ever being filed against him. As these stories accumulated, the scale of what had been happening within the department became undeniable, no longer a single incident involving two rogue officers, but a systemic pattern that had apparently been allowed to continue, unchecked, for years, protected by a culture within the department that prioritized covering for fellow officers over genuinely investigating legitimate complaints from the community. Internal affairs records showed that previous complaints involving Dawson specifically had been reviewed and dismissed multiple times, often within days, with investigating officers citing insufficient evidence, despite never having conducted what could reasonably be described as a thorough inquiry. The public outrage that followed was significant and sustained, fueled not just by the specifics of Maya's case, but by the broader recognition of how many other people had been quietly victimized by the same pattern of behavior, with no meaningful consequences, until someone with Maya's particular background and resources had finally been targeted. Editorial pieces in local and eventually national publications began examining the broader implications of the case, questioning how many similar situations might be occurring in other communities without ever receiving this level of attention or accountability. The story had transformed from a single dramatic incident into something far larger, a genuine reckoning for an entire department's culture and practices. The consequences that followed were swift and comprehensive. Dawson was formally charged with multiple felony counts, including robbery committed under color of law, evidence tampering related to the destroyed security camera, and obstruction of justice for his explicit threats against Maya. His partner, who cooperated more fully with investigators once the weight of the evidence became clear, faced similarly serious charges, though his cooperation in identifying other instances of misconduct within the department resulted in a slightly more favorable plea arrangement. Both men lost their positions immediately, their pensions placed under review pending the outcome of their respective trials, and both now face the very real possibility of significant prison time for crimes that, mere weeks earlier, they had been entirely confident would never produce any consequences whatsoever. The fallout extended well beyond the two officers directly involved. The police chief, having failed for years to properly investigate the pattern of complaints that had been quietly accumulating against Dawson and several other officers, announced his resignation less than a month after the incident, acknowledging publicly that the department's culture had allowed serious misconduct to continue unchecked for far too long. 3 additional officers were placed under investigation based on patterns identified during the broader review of department records, their conduct now being scrutinized with the same intensity that had finally been applied to Dawson's case. The mayor, facing mounting public pressure and a genuine crisis of confidence in city leadership, held a press conference offering a formal public apology to Maya, to the other identified victims, and to the broader community for what she described as a profound and inexcusable failure of accountability within the city's own institutions. Maya's company received formal compensation for the property stolen during the initial incident, along with additional damages awarded through the settlement process that followed the public hearing and subsequent investigation. The amount was substantial, more than enough to fully restore everything that had been taken, and then some. A recognition by the city of exactly how serious and damaging the original incident had truly been. But when the settlement was finalized and the funds were ready for disbursement, Maya did something that surprised even the attorneys who had represented her throughout the process. She declined to accept the portion of the settlement designated as personal compensation for her own suffering and reputational harm, asking instead that the entire amount be redirected into a newly established fund designed specifically to support small business owners who had experienced similar instances of institutional overreach and were unable to afford the kind of legal representation necessary to pursue justice on their own. The fund, which Maya helped structure alongside a small group of civil rights attorneys and community advocates, was designed to provide both financial assistance and legal support to business owners facing situations similar to what she herself had endured, ensuring that future victims would not have to rely on having a background like Maya's in order to receive a fair and thorough investigation into legitimate complaints against law enforcement. Within its first few months of operation, the fund had already assisted several other small business owners in the area, providing both the financial resources and the legal expertise necessary to pursue complaints that might otherwise have quietly disappeared into the same kind of bureaucratic dead end that had protected Dawson for years before Maya's plaints that won a case finally broke the pattern wide open. Several months passed following the resolution of the legal proceedings, and the city itself began to visibly change in response to everything that had been uncovered. The new police chief, brought in from outside the department specifically to help rebuild public trust, implemented mandatory body camera requirements for every officer, with strict policies prohibiting cameras from being disabled or removed under any circumstances without immediate automatic notification, to a centralized oversight office. Search procedures were overhauled entirely, requiring documented warrants or clearly established probable cause before any business or residence could be entered, with random audits conducted regularly to ensure full compliance across every division. Community oversight boards, which had previously existed largely in name only with little real authority, were granted genuine investigative power, including the ability to independently review complaints, without requiring approval from the department's own internal affairs division first. Maya's business, meanwhile, continued operating much as it always had, her employees returning to the same steady rhythm of deliveries and logistics that had defined the company long before any of this had happened. Marcus, who had witnessed the entire incident unfold from beginning to end, found himself looking at Maya differently now, not with less respect, but with an even deeper understanding of exactly why she had always carried herself with such quiet, unshakable composure. He never asked her directly about her military service, sensing correctly that this remained a chapter of her life she preferred to keep private, but he noticed small things now that he had somehow missed before: the careful way she still scanned every room she entered, the discipline with which she handled even the smallest decisions, the quiet strength that had clearly been forged somewhere far more demanding than the logistics industry. The city eventually organized a formal ceremony honoring local veterans, an annual event that had existed for years, but had never carried quite the same significance it would carry this particular time. Maya was invited to speak, an invitation she initially considered declining, given her long-standing preference for staying out of public attention, but ultimately accepted after careful consideration, recognizing that her words might genuinely matter to others who had served and who understood, perhaps better than most, the particular weight of carrying experiences that could never be fully shared with people outside that world. She stood at the podium that evening, dressed simply, just as she had throughout every stage of the public proceedings that followed the original incident, and spoke briefly about service, about the importance of discipline, and about the responsibility that comes with any position of authority, whether that authority is earned through military rank or granted through a badge and a uniform. The room, filled with veterans, active service members, city officials, and members of the community who had followed her story closely over the preceding months, listened in complete silence, the weight of her words carrying far beyond the simple sentences she chose to speak them in. Near the end of the evening, as Maya prepared to step away from the podium, a young officer in attendance, recently graduated from the police academy, and eager to understand more about the woman whose story had reshaped an entire department's culture and procedures, raised his hand and asked a question that had clearly been on his mind throughout her entire speech. He asked her plainly what had stopped her from seeking revenge against the men who had wronged her so completely, given that she clearly possessed both the connections and the capability to pursue a far more severe and immediate form of retribution than the legal process ultimately provided. Maya considered the question for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive, and then offered an answer that would be quoted repeatedly in news coverage of the event over the following days. "A good soldier," she told him, "does not fight because of anger. A good soldier fights to ensure that justice continues to exist for everyone, not just for those powerful enough to enforce it themselves." The room remained silent for a beat after she finished speaking, and then, slowly at first, before building into something far more sustained, the entire audience rose to its feet in genuine, heartfelt applause, a response that lasted considerably longer than ceremonial courtesy alone would have required. As the applause finally began to fade, and Maya stepped down from the stage to rejoin the crowd, the evening light filtering through the hall's tall windows seemed to catch something in her expression that those closest to her recognized as genuine peace, the look of someone who had faced an enormous injustice and had chosen, deliberately and with full awareness of every alternative available to her, to respond not with destruction, but with a kind of accountability that would ultimately protect far more people than any act of personal vengeance ever could have. True power, as she had demonstrated throughout every stage of this entire ordeal, was never about making others fear you. It was about ensuring that those who abused their authority would finally be made to answer for it, fully and completely, before the same system of justice they had once believed themselves entirely above.